Hey, welcome to Historicity Palooza. My name is Jim Eliason. My co-host for the event behind me here is Sean Taylor, the San Diego Coalition of Reason. Before we get started, the restrooms. There are unisex restrooms in this door back here in this building that's open, or you can walk down to the other building to the glass doors and just short walk down the hall will get you to the restrooms also. I have to mention a few names before we start because these things are incredibly difficult to put on. First of all, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. I want to also thank HFSD, the Humanist Fellowship of San Diego, and SADARI, the San Diego Association of Rational Inquiry. They co-sponsored this event, so it took a lot of financial pressure off of us. We appreciate that very much. I want to thank all the usual culprits, Ann and Lena, and the people that always help us out. Special shout out, I think, to a friend of ours who's been a member of the secular community in San Diego for a long time. She'll be moving actually out of the country in short order. She's here tonight, though, and maybe for a little while longer. Debbie Allen is here somewhere. Where are you, Debbie? Debbie, back here. Yeah. She will be very, very missed. I also want to particularly thank the gentleman that allows us to use his business facility, because that's what this is. He's a member of our secular community. This is his business, and he's built this beautiful pavilion out here for various different outdoor events, and he is incredibly generous in allowing us to use this venue for various different events. Mark Olson right over here, please give him a round of applause. Mark, thank you so much. Also want to give a shout out to our sound guy and our guy in the back, Nick, who does all of our filming. The Catholic Answers folks are here and they've been great to work with. They will also be filming. Paul on the side is our sound guy, and he always does a huge job for us, so really appreciate all the work those guys do. And I really also want to thank both gentlemen on my left and my right for being here, Dr. Paul Carrier and Richard Carrier, and Trent Horn for being here to do this, and I'm going to let Sean introduce them. So thank you all again for coming.
Again, thank you everyone for being here. For those of you just received a notice as members of the San Diego Association of Rational Inquiry, there will be no meeting tomorrow because currently you are at the meeting for this weekend. So pay attention, this is this month's assignment. Trent Horn here with Catholic Answers. We thank you for being here this evening. At 17, Trent Horn converted to the Catholic faith and has been passionately defending it ever since. He earned a bachelor's degree in history from Arizona State University and a master's degree in theology from Franciscan University of Steubenville. Trent served as the Respect Life coordinator for the Diocese of Phoenix until he joined the Catholic Answers as a speaker and staff apologist in 2012. Trent is a dynamic speaker and experienced public speaker who has given hundreds of presentations from high school assemblies to keynote conference talks. He is a regular guest on Catholic Answers Live and is also the author of 2 books. I believe they're both for sale out there. Answering Atheism, How to Make the Case for God with Logic and Charity, and Persuasive Pro-Life, How to Talk About Our Culture's Toughest Issue, both published by Catholic Answers Press. And Dr. Richard Carrier, I don't know if really an introduction is needed, but I'll give you one for any of those that you don't know. He's a world-renowned author and speaker. As a professional historian, published philosopher, and prominent defender of the American free thought movement, Dr. Carrier has appeared across the US, Canada, UK, and in American television, London radio, defending sound historical methods and the ethical worldview of secular naturalism. His books and articles have received international attention. With a PhD from Columbia University in ancient history, he specializes in the intellectual history of Greece and Rome, particularly ancient philosophy, religion, and science, with an emphasis on the origins of Christianity and the use and progress of science under the Roman Empire. Please, everyone, give a big round of applause to both of our speakers, Trent Horn from Catholic Answers and Dr. Richard Carrier. Tonight's event is going to be quite fun, quite interesting, quite informative and educational. There's going to be no moderator, so please feel free to yell at them if they don't say something that you like. Please don't you dare. These are honest men. I'm not, apparently. Please turn your cell phones off. Please be courteous, quiet. We are filming. We have wonderful audio, wonderful videographers here, but do be kind to the equipment that is here. Tonight's event is going to start off with Trent Horn giving a 15-minute presentation. Trent Horn giving a 15-minute presentation on the historicity of Jesus. Dr. Carrier will follow with a 15-minute presentation. And then they will go for 30 minutes in a conversation where Trent Horn will question Dr. Carrier's position. Please enjoy. After that, we will have some audience Q&A. There will be a couple of microphones walking around. So after the presentations and discussion, please raise your hand if you have any question. We'll come to you. Enjoy.
All right, well, I want to thank you all again for being here tonight. I want to thank the San Diego Atheists for organizing this event, and I really want to thank Dr. Carrier for being willing to debate this important issue. Let me begin by saying that both Dr. Carrier and myself agree that there was a Jesus connected to the origin of Christianity. Where we disagree is the nature of this Jesus. I, along with the near universal consensus of scholars, hold the view that Jesus was a victim of Roman crucifixion, who later became an object of worship following the proclamation of his resurrection. And I am a Christian because I believe this proclamation is best explained by an actual resurrection. But that won't be what we're debating tonight. Instead, Dr. Carrier, on the other hand, he believes that Jesus never had an historical existence, but that Jesus was a celestial deity who the founders of Christianity saw in hallucinatory visions. Later Christians then wrote Gospels that allegorically described Jesus as having lived on earth, which future readers mistakenly took to be literal biographies. But in order to hold Dr. Carrier's view, you must believe that, 1, the first Christians did not believe in an historical Jesus, and 2, that the gospel accounts of Jesus are 100% fictional. It is my contention that both of these propositions are not true, and so the mythicist model of Christian origins should be rejected. In its place, we should believe that Christianity began with the ministry of an historical Jesus. My first argument for the belief that Jesus existed is that the first Christians believed he had an earthly existence. Let's focus on one of our earliest sources, the letters of Paul. In Galatians 4:4 and Romans 1:3, Paul tells us that Jesus was born, and that he was a Jew descended from the ancestral line of King David. In Philippians 2:6-11, Paul says that Jesus humbly set his divinity aside in order to become human in likeness and appearance. In 1 Corinthians 11:23-25, Paul tells his readers that Jesus took part in a meal of bread and wine on the night he was handed over. In 1 Corinthians 15:3-8, Paul says that Christ died, was buried, and rose 3 days later. Throughout his letters, Paul is adamant that Jesus shed his blood on a cross. Finally, in 1 Corinthians 2:8, Paul says that the rulers of this age killed Jesus. And in 1 Thessalonians 2:13-16, Paul specifically says members of the Jewish community killed Jesus. So it's clear that the first Christians believed Jesus had an earthly existence, which invalidates the mythicist proposal. Now, against these passages, Dr. Carrier claims that Paul only learned about a mythic Jesus by reading from the Old Testament or by hallucinating about Jesus. But I think that Paul received information about Jesus from other people because Jesus existed. Paul tells us himself he knew people who were in Christ before him, people that gave him information, such as the Creed in 1 Corinthians 15:3-7, that confirms Jesus' historicity. In Galatians 1:18-19, Paul even says that he knew the apostles themselves. He writes, "After 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas, and remained with him 15 days. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother." As the famous New Testament scholar C.H. Dodd once said, "We may presume they did not spend all that time talking about the weather." Instead, Paul was able to use those 2 weeks to corroborate his testimony about Jesus through the apostles who previously knew him, including one apostle named James, who was one of Jesus' relatives. But if Jesus were just a celestial deity, then how could he have a flesh and blood relative named James? The answer is that he could not. And so the mythic view of Jesus is false, and the historical view of Jesus is true. Naturally, Dr. Carrier and other mythicists have mounted several rebuttals to the standard interpretation of Paul's letters. But when we examine these alternate interpretations, you'll see they are far less plausible. Let's take a look at just 3 examples. First, regarding Romans 1:3, Dr. Carrier claims that Paul's use of the phrase descended from the seed of David means that instead of Jesus just having David as a biological ancestor, and thus having been born, Paul thought that God literally took King David's sperm from his body and kept it in what Dr. Carrier calls a cosmic sperm bank. After several centuries, God used David's sperm to manufacture Jesus in outer space under the moon. But the only evidence Dr. Carrier has for the antiquity of this belief are legends, Jewish legends about female demons that impregnated themselves with David's sperm. But these legends do not have a cosmic sperm bank motif, since the sperm is used immediately to make demon offspring and is not stored to make messiahs. More importantly, these legends were written 300 to 1300 years after Christ's death, so they have no bearing on first century Jewish thought. Instead, in Romans 1:3, Paul is simply saying that Jesus' parents were of the Davidic line, and if Jesus had parents, that means Jesus existed. Example number 2. Dr. Carrier claims that Paul's numerous references to Jesus' crucifixion refer to Jesus being crucified by the devil in outer space, and not by the Romans on earth. But Dr. Carrier's only evidence that Christians believed something like that comes from a 2nd century document called the Ascension of Isaiah. However, this document has a corrupted textual history that is difficult to reconstruct, and the Christian parts of the document have been dated to the early 2nd century, which means they would not have influenced the New Testament writers. But more damaging to his case, this document describes Jesus passing through the lower heavens on his way to earth. It does not describe Jesus being crucified in the heavens. This means we should accept Paul's description of crucifixion as being a regular earthly experience. Dr. Carrier also claims that in the apocryphal life of Adam, Adam is buried in heaven. So Jesus might have been buried there too. But the text actually says Adam's soul was buried in heaven, while his body remained on the earth. Therefore, we have no reason to believe that references to the burial of Jesus' body could take place anywhere other than earth. Finally, it is extremely unlikely first century Jews expected the Messiah to die either on earth or in the heavens. The common view at the time was that the Messiah would be a victorious conqueror, not a victim of capital punishment. That's why Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1:23 that the cross was a stumbling block in his preaching. You would only preach a crucified Messiah if that's what actually happened to your Messiah. Now let's look at my last example of implausible interpretations. In Galatians 1:19, Paul says he met one of Jesus' relatives. However, Dr. Carrier claims that Paul's use of the title Brother of the Lord just means James was a baptized Christian, not that he was related to Jesus. But if that were true, then why doesn't Paul just call James the brother, to indicate he was a non-apostolic Christian, like he does for Quartus in Romans 16:23, or Apollos in 1 Corinthians 16:12? Instead, a more sensible interpretation of Galatians 1:19 is that Paul is saying he met with the apostles and distinguishes James, which was a very common name, by saying this James was biologically related to Jesus, which means Jesus did exist. One objection to the idea that Paul believed Jesus lived on earth is that Paul's letters do not mention many of the details of Jesus' earthly life, such as his miracles or his trial. But I find this argument to be unpersuasive for 2 reasons. First, Paul's letters were written in response to pastoral and theological problems within Christian communities that already knew the gospel, It was not necessary for Paul to explain details to them that they already knew. Second, even early Christians, who wrote long after the Gospels were composed, did not describe Jesus' earthly ministry. The book of Acts, the letters of John, the book of Revelation, along with non-biblical texts like 1 Clement, the letter of Barnabas, and the letters of Ignatius, all emphasize Jesus' death and resurrection while basically ignoring major aspects of his earthly ministry. It's even common among modern Christians to bypass Jesus' ministry and focus instead on his death and resurrection. Since Christians who knew the gospel stories felt free to not cite them, we cannot conclude Paul was unaware of those stories just because he did not cite them either. My second argument for the historical view of Jesus is that any mythical view of Jesus must reject not just the supernatural details in the Gospels, but every single historical detail about Jesus in those documents. Dr. Carrier says this is plausible because Mark, whose Gospel probably came first, wrote a meta-parable derived from the Old Testament. But what makes this thesis strange is that, one, we know of no other genre of literature like this in the Greco-Roman world. And two, if Mark's entire gospel is an allegory, then incidental historical details can't be incidental or historical. They have to have a deeper allegorical meaning. But Dr. Carrier's explanations of what those meanings are become, well, a bit of a stretch. For example, in Mark 15:21, we read that Simon of Cyrene was forced to carry Jesus' cross, and that he happened to be the father of Alexander and Rufus. The traditional interpretation of this passage is that Mark's Roman audience probably knew of Alexander and Rufus, and that's why Mark included this detail. Paul even sent greetings to a Rufus who was eminent in the Lord in his letter to the Romans. But if these two people existed and their father knew Jesus, then the mythicist theory fails. Dr. Carrier says, therefore, that this reference could instead be an allegory, where Simon of Cyrene represents Cyrenaean hedonistic philosophy. And this philosophy gave birth to Alexander, who represents the failed military ideals of Alexander the Great, as well as Rufus, who represents the Cynic philosophy of Musonius Rufus. Jesus' contact with Simon represents how the celestial Christ absorbed the worldly passions of the Cyrenaean philosophers, along with the failures they gave birth to, and literally crucified them on a heavenly cross with Jesus. Well, just as when we hear hoofbeats in the distance, we should think horses and not unicorns. When we see incidental historical details in the Gospels, we should treat them as such and not read complex allegories into them when the text and the evidence does not warrant it. There's also another problem with the mythic view of Jesus. If it were true, we'd expect it to survive as a heresy, just as the Gnostic and Judaizing heresies survived for centuries. But we have no documents affirming a mythic Jesus, nor do any of the church fathers ever argue against this view. Rather than embrace the implausible mythicist view that these Christians simply vanished from the historical record, it makes more sense to say there was no mythic heresy, because the early Christians did not believe in a mythic Jesus. Unfortunately, I don't have time to discuss the historical value of the extra-biblical references to Jesus, though maybe they will come up in Q&A. Instead, I'd like to address one common argument against the historical Jesus, specifically that Jesus was copied from older Jewish and pagan stories. For example, the Jewish philosopher Philo, as Dr. Carey has argued, is sometimes claimed to have spoken of a Jesus who was the celestial firstborn Son of God and eternal high priest. But in his work on the confusion of tongues, Philo never calls God's firstborn son Jesus. Instead, his constant references to Eden, the East, and the naming of animals as archetypes shows Philo was referring to the Platonic view of Adam, not Jesus. The passage simply cannot be used to support the Jesus myth theory. Other critics say the story of Jesus was drawn from dying and rising pagan gods, like Romulus, Zalmoxis, or Osiris. But T.N.D. Mettinger, in a scholarly monograph where he defends the existence of the dying and rising god motif in the ancient world, concedes that, quote, "There is, as far as I am aware, no prima facie evidence that the death and resurrection of Jesus is a mythological construct, drawing on myths and rites of the dying and rising gods of the surrounding world. While studied with profit against the background of Jewish resurrection belief, The faith in the death and resurrection of Jesus retains its unique character in the history of religions. So to summarize my case, in order to accept the view that Jesus never existed as an historical figure, you have to believe in some really bizarre ideas, very implausible ideas. You have to believe that Paul in his letters is actually talking about cosmic sperm banks, crucifixions under the moon, and burials in outer space, when he seems to just be talking about Jesus being born and dying on a cross. You also have to believe the Gospels contain secret allegories that have been misunderstood for 2,000 years. Finally, you have to believe that the original mythicist Christians simply vanished into thin air and never survived, even as a marginalized heresy. But if you're like me, and you don't have enough faith to believe in all of that, then I suggest you believe in the more parsimonious explanation, that the Christian movement began with the life of an historical Jesus who really did exist. Thank you.
Shorter than this. Okay, there we go. Excellent. Okay. Regarding the Medinger reference, I have a very astute footnote on that in my book. I'll just leave it to that. That's not necessary to go into it here. So if you want to know about that, go there. He's got the Philo passage wrong, so I'm going to go backwards through this discussion. Philo actually says that the character named Jesus in Zechariah 6 is the firstborn son of God, and he's not referring to Adam because he specifically identifies this being as God's agent of creation. In other words, the angel, and calls him an archangel, that God assigned the task of doing the creation for God. He also says that he's a celestial high priest, meaning he's the high priest of the celestial temple in heaven, obviously not Adam. And in the sense that he says he's the firstborn son of God, Philo specifically explains this is before the human Adam was created, because Philo actually teaches a doctrine of two Adams. This is actually well known in the literature on Philo. And he says that this original, the celestial Jesus figure, the celestial agent of creation, firstborn son of God, is also the image of God. Now all of these labels that I've mentioned are all the labels attached to the Jesus in the epistles of the New Testament. It's extremely unlikely coincidence that they're talking about a different being. And the relevance of this is that Philo establishes that there was already an archangel named Jesus who was the firstborn son of God, the agent of creation, the image of God, and the celestial high priest. All of the attributes of the Jesus in the New Testament. He attests then that there was already one of these in the angelology of Judaism before Christianity even arose. So when we see the Christians suddenly talking about what appears to be exactly the same being, we should pay attention to that. And we know that when Paul says in Philippians 2, he actually says that Jesus is a pre-existent being. He also references in 1 Corinthians 8 that he's the agent of creation, so he's been around forever, and that he actually descended and assumed a human body, and then got killed and then was resurrected. So Paul is clearly referencing this same pre-existent archangel. So that's the relevance of that passage, and like I said, he's got that particularly wrong. He mentions that there's no other genre of literature like what I talk about. Actually, almost all literature in antiquity was very similar to this when they were talking about savior deities. You look at all mythology, the use of allegory is very standard in this. We have several pieces of literature and books on this subject. I'm not going to go into detail on that because I don't think it's relevant for this particular debate, but if you want to know more about that, I go into it in my book. Now I want to point out, before I get back to the more meatier stuff, that the Simon of Cyrene example is actually a straw man fallacy, because in my book I specifically explain that this is what I think the most uncertain of the possible allegories, where we don't know whether this is a historical reference or an allegorical reference. The allegorical explanation fits the evidence pretty well. The historical evidence fits it relatively well. Again, because Mark doesn't say who these people are. He doesn't say they're members of the church. He doesn't say they were witnesses or anything. But what he does say is that Jesus tells Peter that he must take up his cross and follow him. Notably, at the crucifixion, Simon Peter is the one who he told that to. He's not the one who picks up the cross. Instead, Simon of Cyrene, a different Simon, picks up the cross and follows him, which is actually a very unusual behavior, that we don't have any examples of this happening in history, of someone carrying the cross for a crucifixion victim. This looks like the kind of allegorical story where you have one Simon, Jesus says, is going to carry the cross, but another Simon does so instead. That's usually a literary clue that there's a particular allegorical reason why the author is doing that, making that switch. But I can't go into debate. I can't go into detail on that here because I don't have time. But I just want to point that out. If you want to go into that further, look at that. I have much better examples of allegory. In fact, in my chapter on this, I cite extensively peer-reviewed scholarship on this. Many scholars, many experts agree with me on the idea that these are parables. John Dominic Crossan just published a book called The Power of Parable, in which he explains that all the Gospels are entirely parables about Jesus. This is mainstream scholarship. This is not me on an outside limb here. He mentions, going back through the things, he mentions Paul's silence doesn't convince him that Jesus didn't exist. But the relevance of that, of course, first of all, is that there isn't that silence is actually shows that the evidence is not there. I'm going to get into the particulars of what he was talking about before. But he says that Paul didn't need to explain things they already knew. The problem is the letters are full of Paul explaining things they already knew. So it's a weird coincidence that when he doesn't explain things they supposedly they already knew, they just happen to be the things that place Jesus on earth. That's a bizarre coincidence, and I think that is a clue. He mentions the James, the brother of Jesus issue. Of course, he doesn't go into detail on how we come to this conclusion about all baptized Christians are brothers of the Lord. Paul says Jesus is the firstborn of many brethren, and that all baptized Christians are adopted by God and therefore become the Son of God, and therefore will inherit the kingdom of God literally. That means they were all brothers of each other because they were sons of God, and that means they were brothers of the Son of God. So all Christians, baptized Christians, were brothers of the Lord. And so Paul shows no indication or sign that he knew of any other kind of brother of the Lord. If you knew that all baptized Christians are called brothers of the Lord, because they are, in fact, all brothers of the Lord, as Paul says, when you're actually referencing an actual biological brother, you would know that you have to make the specific distinction, like, for example, brother of the Lord in the flesh, for example. He would have to distinguish. Paul shows no indication that he understands that there needs to be a distinction made. And the reason he uses the full phrase, by the way, is if he just said brother in that particular context, immediately after mentioning Peter, there could be a literary confusion, grammatical confusion with him possibly referencing the brother of Peter. So he has to be specific what kind of brother he means. In the Greek, this makes more, you would understand why this is. So that is how we would respond to that issue, and how I go into detail in the book as well. He also mentions that Jews would not preach a crucified Messiah. That's not true, or a murdered or killed Messiah. Daniel 9 actually references a dying Messiah. Isaiah 53 actually says the chosen one, a common phrase for the Messiah, would die to atone for the sins, and he would die in some sort of ignominious way. And even the Talmud, the Jews in the Talmud agree that Isaiah 53 references the death of the Messiah. The Messiah will be killed, and then another Messiah will come and resurrect him. So there's actually no evidence that Jews wouldn't preach this idea. In fact, the idea makes a great deal of sense when you look at Hebrews 9, where they're saying that the Messiah had to die in order to atone for all the sins of the world, as Isaiah 53 says, and therefore eliminate the need for the temple cult, which was the whole point of the Christian religion, is to eliminate the need for the constant Yom Kippur sacrifices every year in the temple cult. To have that erased, you had to have a much more magically powerful sacrifice. So that's why they came up with the idea of a sacrifice Lord, because that is the most powerful sacrifice. And if you have that, that sacrifice will cleanse sins forever. And this is explicitly said in Hebrews 9. And that's how they were able to replace the temple. That's why they're coming up with this stuff. He mentioned the revelation of Moses says the soul of Adam is buried in heaven. That's not the case. It actually explicitly says the body of Adam and Eve, by the way, are buried in the third heaven. The point of that being that there were precedents for the idea of burying people in the heavens. The ascension of Isaiah, he mentions as well, that's actually dated by experts between the 80s and 130s AD. Regarding the original redaction, we know it underwent many redactions by later Christian authors. And in the early part of it, it says Jesus will descend to the firmament and will be killed by Satan and his demons. It doesn't mention any descending to earth. That idea was added later in certain manuscripts, but not all of them. We have certain manuscripts that show no knowledge of this addition of the traditional gospel in the middle. So we know the original redaction, or the earliest redaction we can reconstruct, did not have Jesus coming all the way to earth. And so we know there was a gospel preaching this idea of a Jesus crucified by Satan and his demons in the firmament, meaning the lower heavens. He mentioned the passage about being descended from the seed of David. The Greek does not say descended. This is very important. That's an English interpretation. It actually says manufactured from the seed of David. It uses a word that Paul only uses of being or becoming. It's not the word that he uses of human birth. Paul uses a different Greek word for that. This, in fact, disturbed later Christians so much that they tried to doctor the manuscripts to actually change it to the word for born that Paul would normally use. Instead, Paul uses the same word that he uses of how God manufactured the body of Adam. He uses the same word that he uses for how God manufactures or will manufacture our future resurrection bodies. These are not bodies that are born to women. These are not bodies that are born to parents. So Paul is using a language of divine creation, not a language of birth. He actually gives no reference to Jesus having parents. He never references his father or even his mother. Even in the passage in Galatians 4 where he says that Jesus is born of a mother, he uses again that same word, manufactured, being or becoming from a mother. He actually says in that passage, in the whole argument, that the argument is talking about an allegorical mother. He says this is an allegory. And he says we are born of that same mother, meaning the mother is this world of flesh. So he's actually not talking about a human mother there. And if you look at the entire argument of Galatians 4 in context, you can see that that's what Paul is talking about. He doesn't actually reference, for example, this being Mary or any kind of human person. There isn't any other reason for him to do so. What else do we have to address? He references Romans 16:7, for example, where Paul talks about people who were in Christ before him. That's not usable evidence because we know Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 that what converted people to Christianity, what made them apostles, was having a vision of the Christ. Obviously, there were people who had visions of the Christ and started their religion before Paul joined on. That doesn't tell us anything about whether these visions of Jesus were the only thing that started it, or whether Jesus actually handpicked them. And that's the interesting point, is that every single place where Paul would mention this, for example, in 1 Corinthians 15, there's no reference to Jesus having disciples or picking disciples. Paul never refers to the word disciple. It's not in his epistles. He only knows about people who saw Jesus after he died. In 1 Corinthians 15, you notice you go through the sequence of events, there's no ministry there, there's no miracles, there's no human testimony involved in this, there's no handpicking of disciples. The first time anyone sees Jesus in this sequence of events is after his death, in other words, in Revelations. You look through all the epistles of Paul, there's no reference to Jesus having a ministry. There's no reference to Jesus being a miracle worker. There's no reference to disciples, and no clear reference to Jesus being on earth. Every single time there is a reference to something like him being crucified or dying or being buried, we don't know whether he's referring to the earth or the heavens, and therefore we have to look at the context to understand which it might be. And so when we look at all of the other passages, when we look at Philippians 2, for example, where Jesus descends and becomes human, this doesn't contradict my theory at all. In fact, this actually matches it. The whole idea is that Jesus had to assume a body of flesh. And in fact, scripturally, by actual prediction, by prophecy, it had to be Davidic flesh in order to fulfill prophecy and therefore cleanse the world of sin. God manufactures a body out of Davidic flesh, and that would be the one possible explanation. But the key thing is in Philippians 2, Paul never references Jesus having a ministry. Again, never references him picking disciples, never references him being a miracle worker. In fact, it denies it by saying that Jesus divested himself of all divine powers and becoming the equivalent of a human slave. So this idea of becoming incarnate and dying completely matches the idea of being crucified in heaven by Satan, and this is exactly what we see in the earliest reconstructed redaction of the ascension of Isaiah. We also see it sort of sideline referenced in 2 Peter, which is in the epistles. 2 Peter is widely recognized by experts today to be a forgery, and it was written in the 2nd century, and it says it's responding to Christians who are preaching that the Gospels, essentially the stories about Jesus, were cleverly devised myths. And he says, no, they weren't cleverly devised myths, because we actually saw Jesus, and then it immediately forges an eyewitness testimony to having seen and met Jesus. And he says that these Christians are the ones who should be called anathema and avoid, but this means that there were Christians preaching that there were no eyewitnesses to an earthly Jesus, that in fact the Gospel stories were cleverly devised myths. In other words, allegories because he's speaking polemically. They wouldn't say it in that polemic fashion. So we do have testimony to there being a sect like this that actually thought. We have the Ascension of Isaiah, we have 2 Peter, and we have Irenaeus, who actually assumes that certain Gospels match his Gospels, but when he talks about what they mean, he only references in heretical sects. He's saying certain heretical sects believe that Jesus was born in outer space, he was born in the celestial realm, and that the whole act played out there. This is in Irenaeus, and he's talking about these heretical sects, and we don't know how accurately he's depicting what they were talking about, but from his description of them, it sure looks like it matches what we're looking at here. So we do have evidence of there having been this sect, but of course, this isn't the sect that acquired power in the 4th century and therefore decided which texts would survive the Middle Ages, or in what condition. It's the other sect, the historicist sect, that decided what evidence we would get to see. That creates an extreme problem for deciphering the evidence. You can't expect certain things to survive that they would not have preserved. We have the same thing in 1 Corinthians 11, where Paul says that he gets this story of the Eucharist, the Jesus message, directly from Jesus. In other words, he doesn't get it from human testimony. He says, I learned it from the Lord. That is significant, because Paul, all throughout his letters, only ever refers to Revelation and Scripture as his only sources. He never refers to human testimony. In Romans 16, he says the gospel is only known through revelations and Scripture. In 1 Corinthians 15, he only references Scripture and visions. And so we go through all of the text, and that every single time, even in Galatians, Paul goes out of his way to insist that he didn't learn it from human tradition. He may have done, he may be lying, but the point of it is that he had to insist this because human tradition wasn't trusted. To be an apostle, you had to have a vision of Jesus and learn the gospel directly from Jesus. But to him, this meant visions of Jesus, and he seems to have no other idea of how you would know Jesus. So when he does go eventually, finally, years later, to go meet the original apostles who started the cult, there's no reference to him checking his facts against their eyewitness testimony. He doesn't talk about that. All he does is corroborate that his gospel is compatible with their gospel, and as we know from 1 Corinthians 15, all this gospel came by the same method through revelations of Jesus. So there's no thing here that actually connects us with any kind of historical ministry. Paul never references it. It's not there. Even when we get to 1 Corinthians 2, when we talk about the rulers of this age, those are actually the archons of this aeon, is one way to translate it. It's actually a highly bizarre phrase to use, and one that Paul never uses of secular powers. We do know that this combination of words and the words like them could be used to refer to demons, and often were. For example, he calls Satan, or one passage says that Satan is the god of this world, for example, and we know archons was a common reference, a common term for demons. So when he says the rulers of this age killed Jesus, we can't tell from that passage alone whether he means archons of this aeon as in the demons of this world, or actual human rulers. He never says the Romans did it, he never says the Jews did it. Even in 1 Thessalonians 2, which was referenced here, that is widely agreed in the field to be an interpolation. Paul never wrote that. Paul did not say the Jews killed Jesus, because that passage is so anti-Semitic, we know it contradicts all of the other teachings of Paul. And we know, for example, that it was written after the destruction of the temple of the Jews, because it says that the wrath of God has come upon them at last to punish them for this, which is an obvious reference to the destruction of the temple. There's no other event that would be the final wrath of God upon the Jews for killing Jesus. Paul actually taught that all the Jews would be saved. So his idea that the wrath of God would condemn the Jews also does not make any sense for Pauline thought. And many other scholars have noted this. This is in the peer-reviewed literature. In my book, I cite the scholars who thoroughly argue that that's one passage in 1 Thessalonians 2 is an interpolation. It was a later anti-Semitic Christian insertion, not the original words of Paul. Now, how much time do I have? I have 3 minutes. Okay. So when we look at the Gospels, we have the similar issue. This looks very similar to other gods we have. For example, we have biographies written of Romulus. We have the kind of like the Gospels of Hercules. We have essentially something very similar to the Gospels written about Aesop. These are non-existent people, and they have whole elaborate biographies written about them. We have a similar thing in the Old Testament, where Moses, it's pretty widely agreed in mainstream scholarship today that Moses is a mythical person. He did not originally exist. Exodus and Deuteronomy are essentially gospels that were fictionally written about this guy. So when we see lots of literature like this, where people were constantly inventing myths and stories and biographies of non-existent people, when we look at something like the Gospels that are full of supernatural and ridiculous events, that look very similar to these things, we really can't tell that they are historical versus mythical. And in my book, I don't argue that the Gospels prove Jesus didn't exist. I just argue that they don't offer proof that he did, because they look too much like the same thing we get for other non-existent deities. Okay, so I'll end just briefly talking about the parallels, the parallel gods. It's very suspicious, I think, that you would have all around the Jews, every single other culture in the era, the Persians inside the Roman Empire, the Persians in the Roman Empire, the Syrians in the Roman Empire, the Greeks in the Roman Empire, the Egyptians in the Roman Empire, even the Celts through the Thracians. All of them adopted this idea of taking their religion and combining it with a dying and rising god cult. They all did this. They all did this with non-existent gods, but they all claimed these gods existed in history and time and wrote stories about them. This is what Zalmoxis is, the Thracian version of it. Mithra is the Persian version of it, although he's not a dying and rising god. He does undergo a passion. He undergoes a struggle or suffering through which he acquires victory over death. But we also have Osiris, who is a plainly dying and rising god, and notably, Osiris was taught publicly that he was a historical pharaoh who was later deified, placed in history, and stories are told about him similar to the Gospels and their miracle content. But in the stories that were told among the higher priesthood, these were allegories, they specifically said, and this we get from Plutarch, allegories for a cosmic death and resurrection, that in fact Osiris actually descended just below the moon, became incarnate, and was killed there and resurrected. So here we have a direct parallel. We have a whole religion in which we have a dying and rising cult that predates Christianity, that is immediately adjacent to Judea, in Egypt, where there's a major population of Jews who would be going on pilgrimages to Jerusalem every year. And here they are worshiping a god that looks exactly like the god we're talking about in the Ascension of Isaiah, and in my theory as well, for the Jews. So it looks like what happens is the Jews were surrounded by these dying and rising gods and these mystery cults that also had fictive brotherhoods, just like Christianity, and basically tried to create a Jewish version of this. A Jewish palatable version, of course. The whole idea of syncretism is that you combine two different things to come up with one that will be acceptable to the local cult that will be different from all the others. So you can't point to differences that are relevant. What's relevant is they took the basic core idea of a mystery religion in which you gain salvation in the afterlife through baptisms. A lot of these involved baptism. The idea of doing that by worshiping a son of God who was crucified, or even a daughter of God in some cases, not necessarily crucified, but killed and resurrected, this was so common around there. And then suddenly for the Jews to actually get one, it's highly improbable that they just spontaneously thought of this on their own, without any influence from all their neighbors around them, or all of the pilgrims, by the way, because all their neighbors contained diaspora Jewish communities would be going on pilgrimages to Judea all the time. It's impossible that they didn't know about this, and it's highly unlikely that this was a coincidence. And yet all these other dying and rising gods, all these other suffering and struggling savior gods, all of them were non-existent people. So it would be an extraordinary claim to say that Jesus is the only one who actually was a historical person. That's all I have to say right now, but I'll just end in general that you can't expect this debate to be resolved here. He and I have only just barely touched the tip of the iceberg of this debate. So I highly encourage you to read my literature. I highly encourage you to read any literature he recommends and compare the case for and against the historicity of Jesus beyond this debate, and we can move forward from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, just out of curiosity, quick show of hands, is there anything that someone thought or assumed before that they now question at least? Nothing. You're still certain of whatever you came in with. So, there's one person that has not read their books yet. Okay, good. Well, for anyone that still needs to, read the books, their books are going to be for sale afterwards, and now for the next 30 minutes we're going to have an open conversation between the two of them. And Trent, please take it away. He does have some questions, unlike all of you here. So Trent's going to ask Dr. Carey some questions. They're going to have a conversation. Enjoy.
All right. Well, we did cover a lot of points, so let's try to move these and see where we agree or disagree. Like you, I will move backwards as well through your presentation, and let's go through these. All right. So you said that Osiris, that Plutarch talks about how that publicly he's said to be, buried, has lived on Earth, and that is what we see in Onisis and Osiris. The influential men of Egypt want to be buried in tombs, just like Osiris is buried. But why do you think, though, that Plutarch's views that he would have been killed in outer space like Jesus would apply to normal people. In fact, you yourself have said in a previous debate, you said, Plutarch is well known for rewriting and distorting facts to suit his Greek sensibilities, but Christianity arose from illiterate masses. Thus, Plutarch's views could be worlds away from anything the Osiris worshippers or early would-be Christians may have known or believed. So, who's right? Present carrier or past carrier?
Present carrier, of course. I was actually very much mistaken. I was buying into the consensus view that Christianity was originated by illiterate people, illiterate Hicks, you might say. There's actually no evidence of that. All of the evidence we have strongly supports the conclusion that there were actually literate rabbis that originated the sect. And there's a variety of arguments I can give for that, but I don't want to take away your time in doing that. But if you want to ask after that, I can.
Okay, well, I guess back to Osiris.
But we want to get to that, yeah. So the whole idea is that when Plutarch writes this book, it's called On Osiris.
And I'm not talking about the earliest Christians. I'm talking about the Osiris and Isis worshippers.
So when Plutarch writes this book on Isis and Osiris, it's dedicated to a priestess of the cult of Isis. And when he talks about the teaching that Osiris descended below into the lower heavens and died and so on, in that location and not on earth, he says that's what the priests of Isis and Osiris said. There's no way he could say that that's what the priests of Isis and Osiris said to a priestess of Isis and be lying or making it up. It's very clearly that he's recording reverently for her, for his correspondent, the actual truth of the matter.
But would you agree, though, that in the Isis and Osiris myth, Osiris is not a dying and rising god in accordance with Jewish resurrection belief, because his body remains buried while he stays and dwells in the underworld? He may communicate in visions, but the body is just stuck in the tomb, unlike the Jewish resurrection belief with Jesus.
That's actually not true. There are a variety of local cults that claim to have a piece of the body of Osiris. But when you look at the actual myths themselves, in fact, we have this carved on the pyramid texts hundreds of years before Christianity, where we specifically have descriptions of Osiris being resurrected by his bones being assembled and him rising out of the grave and unwrapping his mummy wrap, essentially. These are very explicit descriptions of physical resurrection, and this was what was expected to happen. But of course, there were a lot of local cults that had different things that disagreed with the main cult. But the one that got spread across the Roman Empire was the one that spoke of the death and resurrection of him. But this, again, is only a reference to the earthly tales. When we look at Plutarch talking about the descent and incarnation and resurrection of Osiris in the heavens, obviously he's talking about a full-on dying and rising god.
You would agree, though,
talking about tombs.
But Plutarch is writing after Paul and after even the later Gospel and New Testament writers.
He's writing around the same time the Gospels were written.
Okay, but he wouldn't have been influencing Paul.
No, I wouldn't say he's influencing Paul. He's recording an existing religious belief that could have influenced Paul. I wouldn't even say Paul's the right one, because Paul inherited this idea from previous Christians.
Okay. Well, let's move on, because we have a lot of ground to cover.
Sure, yeah.
How about 1 Thessalonians 2:14 through 16? Your argument, and I'm not going to accept that it's widely accepted this is interpolation. Now, unlike other passages, such as the woman who's being stoned, it's not in brackets in the text or anything like that. So it's disputed. Your arguments were, one, it's not Paul's because it's anti-Semitic, and it talks about the wrath of God. It's possible the passage could be authentic except for the wrath of God part, right?
No, because the whole sentence only makes sense by saying that, by adding that piece to it. Because the whole argument of it is trying to explain. Of course, it doesn't really fit entirely into the context, which is why one reason we suspect it as well. But the whole argument is that the Jews are the ones who killed Christ, and he immediately says, and therefore, but the wrath of God has come upon them at last. The whole context of it doesn't make sense if you pull that out. There's no need for him to reference that.
Well, on the anti-Semitic part, Paul himself says in 2 Corinthians 11:24, and he says, I received 39 lashes from the Jews. And Romans 11:2 through 10, he talks about how the Jews killed the prophets. Would you agree that it's possible Paul's writing style could be different, given that Thessalonians is his first letter and Romans is his last? Would you agree your own writing style has changed in 10 years?
Oh, I'm not talking about style. I don't think that's relevant here.
Or even attitudes. You change your attitude on Osiris.
Well, but you got to look at Romans. In Romans, Paul says all the Jews will be saved. So,
but he also
your sequence of events doesn't make sense. He was anti-Semitic and then became totally pro-Jewish.
Yeah, he's getting better. Progress.
So I don't know how that fits in with being lashed by the Jews in between. That would seem to make the trajectory go the other direction. That would make no sense as a trajectory for Paul, because Paul is very clearly, he sees himself as a Jew.
Well, couldn't he be mad, though, at the time writing the Thessalonians, if the account in Acts 17 is correct, that he was given trouble by the synagogues in Thessalonica?
There's no way that would lead him to condemn, say that all Jews are condemned. When Paul repeatedly throughout his letters says that the Jews are going to be saved. And even, especially in Romans, it's very elaborate teaching on this. And Paul himself clearly regarded the Jewish segment of the church, even though when they were hostile to him, he actually believed that they could be united. So his whole idea was not that they were all condemned. We see this in Galatians. He doesn't say, oh, that Jewish church, they're going to be condemned. No, Paul is actually trying to unify the two sides of the church. So he's actually not going to be preaching that all the Jews are damned, especially since all of his churches are interfaith. He's actually got Jewish Christians and non-Jewish Christians. There's no way that Paul could go full anti-Semitic. That only makes sense in the 2nd century, after the 2 Jewish wars, when Christians actually had a strong motivation to disassociate themselves from the Jews because they were receiving such wrath from the Romans.
Okay, well, let's move on then. How about talking about the sources of Paul's knowledge? You've said that it's only in Revelation. He didn't receive this from anyone else. Now, you would agree, what is your status of 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7? It appears to be a creed. Now, I know that the words before say, I received this, as I received this, I delivered it also to you.
Yep.
What I'm understanding is your argument that just because Paul uses the word receive in another letter in Galatians to talk about receiving the gospel, which is that Christ sent his son as the Messiah, from God directly, that in this other letter written years apart, he's not receiving this from anyone. But isn't that very implausible, given that 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7 is a systematic creed with a lot of historical information? Where is Paul getting the information that these appearances happened, or that Jesus died and he was buried? It doesn't seem like he's getting it from God. He's getting it from other people.
Sure, it's entirely possible he did. But he couldn't claim that, right? He has to claim, even if he did
What do you mean he
them,
couldn't claim that? That's in Galatians.
In Galatians, he specifically makes it clear that no one would regard him as an apostle if he learned this from human testimony.
If he learned the gospel.
Well, yeah, but this is the gospel.
No, well, the gospel...
The crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, that's the gospel.
No, well, the crucifixion wouldn't be the gospel. That's just something that happened, if it happened. The gospel would be that God has sent his son as the Messiah and raised Jesus from the dead.
Yeah, which
so
requires
the word
him to
gospel,
die.
What?
Which requires him to be crucified. You can't skip that part.
Right, but you don't need to learn that part from God himself. Surely Paul would have figured some of this out, at least getting information that he's persecuting these people before he converts.
Yeah, I mean, there's a difference between how Paul actually learned these things and what he was claiming, right? Mm-hmm. So when he actually claims that he's received this revelation from Jesus and is imparting it to his congregations, he could full well be lying. He could full well be fibbing. He could full well say, yeah, I was hearing this and hearing this from human testimony, but then Jesus appeared to me and confirmed it to me. It doesn't matter which thing he's saying. What thing does matter is that he only ever says that he learned this stuff from Revelation. That's what he's communicating to the public.
Well, and see, I would just disagree, because in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7, he's using the rabbinic terminology of handing on and receiving. He says,
but that's
as I received it, I also delivered it to you, which seems to imply the delivery is the same as the reception, or very similar.
No, it's the exact same word in Galatians, talking about receiving.
Right, but when we use
same word.
Right, but when you agree,
it's literally the same word.
But when we use words, context matters, right?
Well, yeah, but there is no context here that establishes.
Well, no, like if I was
to
say, I received a gift today, so you have to figure out who am I receiving it from to figure out what the gift is or its nature.
Yeah, but if you had previously said that you received this gift from God, then that kind of answers your question. When we see it in Galatians, it's the only place where Paul actually says where he received his information from is from God. He never says he received it from human testimony.
In Galatians
he denies he received it
in
from
Galatians 2,
human
he never says that what he's received are historical. He doesn't explicitly say it's the crucifixion, right, or these historical facts.
Yeah, but you can't infer either way, right? So he's the only time Paul ever references getting information about Jesus, he always says it's from Revelation or Scripture. And he says this even in Romans 16. He's very explicit that the gospel, the kerygma, comes by revelation and by Scripture. There's no reference there to human testimony, no reference to disciples.
Well, he says that it's been disclosed now and made known through the revelation of the prophets. So it's being confirmed.
I know, but that's it. He doesn't reference in that passage.
Well, he's saying that something has happened now to make clear the light of what's been there.
Yeah, the revelation. Yeah, look at the passage. There's no point at which Paul in the epistles actually says anything other than revelation or Scripture were sources.
But you and I seem to agree that there is a creed he's receiving, even if he's not owning up to where it came from.
Oh, sure, yeah.
So that it's...
Yeah, and there's a clearer case to make your point in Philippians 2, where there's a really good case that Philippians
Right,
2
the Common Christian.
is a very, very early Christ myth that long predates him. So either Paul has got that, because like I said, he's either lying about where he gets it from, but that's still the relevant point, is that he has to get it from Revelation, because that's the only place anyone else who is an apostle can get it from. Or did learn it the human way, but then had it confirmed to him by Revelation, which would not make him a liar, which would make it consistent. I think those are the most likely explanations. Or you could try to infer that he got it from human testimony only, but the point is that he never says that. In fact, he denies it. He says, I did not receive this information by human testimony. And he seems,
But,
he has to
but in
deny
Galatians 2, what is the gospel he's concerned about, though? It seems to be related to the gospel of grace and the gospel of works, not necessarily whether Jesus actually died or not. And so I think you and I are having a fundamental disagreement over what the term gospel means, that it would have been a mundane fact Jesus has died. The question is the meaning of the death and whether it's connected to Jesus' messiahship.
Yeah, but I think that's a red herring fallacy, though, because the whole point is that there's no evidence in the epistles of Paul saying that there was any human testimony. He never references disciples, never says the gospel came down from the disciples, never says Jesus handpicked these guys. He never says he had to corroborate the story with them. He never talks about a historical
then
Jesus in that sense.
How did it come to be that then both Paul and the apostles, because he goes and meets them a few years later, they are essentially preaching the same thing? How does that come about if it's happened independently?
Well, I've answered that multiple times. It's quite possible that he actually
they both have to have the same tricked out hallucinations, which seems implausible.
Well, that happens quite a lot. I mean, look at
the same.
Yeah, no, not identically the same. They don't sit down and compare notes.
It's gotta both be Jesus, pre-existent Son of God, come to earth and died. I mean, it's narrow.
Yeah, but that's actually extremely broad. That's not like where you're sitting down and then what color shirt was he wearing? No. So
I don't know. When I have Robert over to my house for dinner, it's a narrow claim. It's not like just some guy.
No. It's quite common. It's quite common in cults like Shaker cults and so on to have corroborating visions all the time. People often have visions of Jesus now that actually corroborate what the common belief of their particular sect says.
Right.
That's common. I mean, to have a bunch of people have belief, or
but
have
they're learning it
that
from a pre-existing source in the Gospels, not Paul and Peter. Peter in the church, Paul, an outsider of it.
Back then, that was the same thing, right? I mean, they're getting the idea from the scriptures. Isaiah 53, Daniel 9, Zechariah 6. This is where they're getting these ideas.
Isn't it interesting? Why doesn't Paul then, he says this is according to the scriptures, or I would say in accordance with. If these scriptures are so important, that's where they learned it, why aren't they cited in the New Testament?
Oh, well, you answered that question yourself. When he says according to the scriptures, it's conspicuous that he doesn't say where, right? Mm-hmm. But you agree that they were. If he says that it's according to the scriptures, that he had actual scriptures in mind, right?
He says they're in accord with some kind of scriptures.
Right, but he doesn't tell us what they are.
Right, but
what would be your explanation for why he doesn't mention them?
Why he doesn't mention them?
The specific scriptures. Why he doesn't say it's in Isaiah 53.
Well, that right there, that's just a creed he's handed on. And the point of the creed isn't necessarily the fulfillment of prophecy. It's the fact that Jesus has died and each line is providing evidence for the previous line before it. That's not the main point of the creed to prove the prophecy. It's just a historical recollection of what happened.
But my point is that he saw no need to actually mention which verses or quote them in that passage. Mm-hmm. And as you said, he didn't need to all the time, right? Because when he's saying that creed, he already knows, everybody knows what scriptures he's talking about. And probably it's a number of scriptures, so it wouldn't be like one scripture he would cite.
Well, let's go on. I think one of the key, there seem to be three areas where you really need for your theory to work, for it to be plausible that, Paul talks a lot about the death of Jesus. That's the primary focus for him. And someone reading it just at the surface level, it would seem to appear cross, staros, whatever it is, crucified, this happens on earth. Paul believed in a human Jesus, except unless he shares the same view as the ascension of Isaiah. But I mean, I have a copy of it right here. Maybe you can point out to me. I'm not seeing where it says Jesus is going to die in the heavens. So the passage you're talking about is 9 through 11. 9 predicts the descent, 10 is the descent, 11 is the consequences of the descent of the Messiah. And in 9,
it goes 9 and 10. 9 is the prediction, right? And he goes through what you're about to see. So 9 is a summary of 10 and 11. So it's very key that 9 does not agree with the entire content of 11.
Only with some of the manuscripts.
Well, actually, with two that we know that are actually show that they are earlier than the one that has the interpolation in it. But that's key, because when you have
Wait,
nine,
I can't let that slip
Yeah.
by. We have to
Yeah.
talk about this for people who don't. We're geeking out
Right.
up here pretty
Yeah,
bad.
yeah,
So
yeah.
we need
So we
to. Everyone listening might not know what we're talking about.
Valid point.
Okay, so let me just say, so in chapter 9, oh gosh, most people here don't know what's in the Ascension of Isaiah, but so as Isaiah goes in heaven, sees this vision, and an angel who brought him up there, he talks about the descent of Christ, and what he says, so Isaiah sees previous human beings who don't have their crowns yet, they will get their crowns. This will happen for them when the beloved descends. It will be thought he is flesh and blood, and the God of that world, or the earth, which seems to be a reference to 2 Corinthians 4:4, will stretch forth his hand against the sun. They will crucify him on a tree. I don't see anything in there that it's the demons doing
the
this.
God of that world.
The God of that world.
That's the name of Satan. That's
Right.
even in the epistles.
Which
the New
world?
Testament.
Right, but which world is he the God of?
Everything below the moon. I mean, this is well established in demonology of Judaism. Everything below the moon is the devil's territory.
Right, but so that was
This is even in the Ascension of
but
Isaiah.
that includes the earth too.
It does,
the
but,
God
but
of this
notice,
world.
but notice the Ascension of Isaiah, when he ascends, he actually ascends to meet or to see Satan in the lower heavens.
Right.
Yeah,
But
it never says Satan's battling or doing anything or engaging in any activity on earth. It's all in the lower heavens.
No.
And then when he has Jesus
But
descend,
Jews could believe Satan can remain in heaven and affect things on earth.
Yeah,
For
but-
example, in the book of Job, he delivers up Job. He doesn't go down to earth to afflict him. He can stay in heaven and do that.
exactly.
Right.
So there's no reference to Satan being on earth in the Ascension of Messiah.
But he can affect things on earth
Yeah,
to
but
kill the Messiah.
possible does not mean probable. So when we
I'm
look,
not, but I have more. But here,
when you read the
that
text-
goes to your theory also.
yeah, when he says the God of that world stretched out his hand and they killed them, the only they that is referenced at any point before that are the demons that
No,
are in the
it does not say that. It only talks about Satan, and the they are the human beings, the saints who are in heaven.
The
Like
saints
Abel.
killed Jesus?
No, he's saying that they, referring to human beings, other humans.
Oh, no. He can't be referring to saints in heaven as human beings, as the ones who killed Jesus.
No,
When he
obviously
references-
not Abel and them did.
Yeah, I know.
But there's no demons.
No,
here.
you wouldn't say they and then mean the meaning of that pronoun would be the saints in heaven. That cannot possibly be the interpretation.
But there's no demons in this passage either. It only mentions the devil.
No, it doesn't. When he ascends, he actually sees Satan
Right,
and the
but
other
you know what
demons battling
surprises
there.
me in that passage? He goes up there, they see him, and they begin to worship him. And they
Oh,
only
that's
say...
later. When Isaiah is first being ascended, he's being disguised by the angel.
Mm-hmm.
He sees Satan and his demons battling in the firmament.
Right, and then he disguises himself so they don't notice him. And then in chapter 10, it says he proceeds to those who are in the air below the firmament.
Well, that's problematic because that's a reference not to Isaiah, that's a reference to Jesus.
Right.
And that one line only exists in the Latin and the Slavonic. And the key thing is that line does not fit there. It actually doesn't make sense in context. You can actually see there's a broken
But in the
sentence.
Latin and Slavonic manuscripts, which you said are interpolations, I could
No,
argue...
no,
how-
they lack the interpolation.
Right, no, you're calling it an interpolation. The passage in 11 where Jesus descends to earth, and this appears to be docetic Christianity. He goes to earth, he's nursing from Mary,
Yeah, it's
just to
really-
keep up appearances.
Really elaborate, bizarre gospel
So
that
if it's
doesn't
a-
fit the rest of the text.
Well,
yeah.
it fits right into the text perfectly because he goes through the firmament and takes on the flesh of each level to fool the angels. Then when he gets to the earth, he takes on a flesh to fool the human beings. And so you said it's interpolation, but the Latin and Slavonic manuscripts could be redacting this because it's a docetic heresy. So I don't think it works that way either.
Yeah, it's unlikely because the Latin and Slavonic are unaware of the combined text of the death of the martyrdom of Isaiah and the ascension of Isaiah. The interpolation only exists in the combined text. So the Latin and Slavonic are actually a much earlier version of the text. They're unaware of the combination of these two. When the two are combined, they actually have references to that interpolation in both pieces of the combination.
Well, how do you explain, though, in chapter 11, when Jesus ascends, reveals who he truly is, the devil and the angels, they worship him, and they only say to themselves, oh, how did you get by us the first time? They don't ever say anything like,
I know,
we're
there's-
really sorry we killed you. You know,
Actually,
why
there's a-
doesn't that happen?
We know there's a whole section missing because in 9 it says that there's going to be a powerful voice of God is going to descend, and all of these things are going to happen which are not in the text. So we know something's been removed because it actually predicts that something's going to be in chapter 10.
So
and
you're
it's
going
not
to agree,
there.
though, that there is the textual history you're basing your theory really, beside from the ascension of Isaiah, we have no other text at this time that talks about someone being crucified in the Judeo context. first century Palestine, we don't have anything else that talks about someone being killed in the firmament, as opposed to on earth being crucified.
No, but we don't have a lot of things like that, but we know lots of things like that went on in the heavens, right? So it's an entirely conceivable theory. But here we have this one redaction that does suggest that that's what's going on, and we have something similar in 2 Peter.
But we see there's problems, even you'll admit, with the textual history of it.
Even 2 Peter, for example, is referencing Christians who are talking about it being a cleverly devised myth and not a witnessed event.
Well, hold on a minute. In 2 Peter 1:16, there's just the blanket charge, we did not follow myths. Then in 2 Peter 2:1, the author says that just as there were false prophets among the Jews, there will be false teachers among you. And it doesn't say anything about the myth part right there. It says they might deny the master.
What it says is
but it's vague. We don't know what it means.
Oh, well, what it does mean, he says, we did not follow cleverly devised myths. We were eyewitnesses of his majesty.
Right, but we don't know if that's directed to Christians. Anyone who wasn't a Christian at this time could say, "Oh, that never happened." The point is,
it's a flowing argument. You can see that it's the same argument going through. He doesn't suddenly switch between talking about Christian heretics and then suddenly talk about.
Yeah, he does, because in chapter 3 he says the scoffers he's dealing with are people who knew the Lord, but were going to deny his second coming. So he does change topics.
These are still Christians, though. The whole letter is about Christians. At no point does he suddenly say, "Oh, by the way, I'm going to stop talking about Christians. Now I'm going to talk about non-Christians who are."
Well, who says he's only talking about different Christians? He could be talking about anyone who's going to scoff, whoever they might be. And so some non-Christian scoffers will say it's a myth. But then you have Christian scoffers who were once in the Lord, he says in chapter 3, but before then fall away and deny it because of the lack of the parousia.
Through chapter 1 and 2, though, it's clearly he's talking about fellow Christians who are the ones who are actually going to be like this. So, I don't see any indication that he's talking about non-Christians there. So I don't see that. And the point being is that this still actually stands as evidence, regardless if you can try and interpret it away, but then you're just basically basing that on your own assumption of what the text says.
No, I'm just saying,
rather than admitting that the text could plainly say that.
But we don't. You have to interpret it to fit your meaning also.
Actually, I just interpret it the way it's written.
It just says they deny. No, they deny. When it's talking about Christians, they deny their master. We don't know who the myth charge is being directed against.
Clearly, it's being directed against the guy who's writing 2 Peter and his sect. I mean, he's rebutting that by inventing an eyewitness experience with Jesus to actually attest to this. And it's notable that when he does invent that, he invents an earthly event rather than a post-resurrection event, which you would expect if he was trying to establish that they were eyewitnesses confirming that he was resurrected from the dead.
Well, let's go to another passage then, because I think this is going to go back to what did Paul believe. I think you and I would agree, you're trying to prove that the first Christians adhered to this mythic view. So even if Paul, we have these silences, they could be puzzling. If we can see that he's talking about an earthly Jesus, then the silences are just silences. We, have to let that go. You're correct in Romans 1:3 and Galatians 4:4. Paul uses the Greek word ginomai, but how can you say that ginomai primarily means manufacture or make? I mean, the proper Greek verb for make would be poeo. In Thayer's lexicon, in Bauer, the primary meaning is just to become or come into existence. And in Liddell and Scott, they say when ginomai is used of people, it means born, but of things, it means made. So it's the. I actually say manufacture is the sub meaning of ginomai.
I actually answered this already. Paul uses that exact same word of Adam and our future resurrection bodies. Paul never uses that word of human birth. Paul uses another word of human birth. So we know Paul's vocabulary. When he uses this word, he's talking about divine manufacture in the case of Adam and in the case of our future resurrection body.
But ginomai
he never uses it in reference to birth. He uses a different word when he does talk about human birth.
But isn't it possible that Paul is using a different word to mean that the incarnate pre-existent Son of God has become man? He hasn't just had a normal human birth.
Sure. Possible is not probable, though. You can't get evidence.
Isn't a more objective translation of the passage, like Romans 1:3, Galatians 4:4, he came to be of the seed of David, or he came to be of a woman, he came to be under the law.
Just like Adam in our future resurrection body.
Right, but with Adam and our future resurrection bodies, we get context, and Paul gives us context. If someone would say to you,
he doesn't say he was born to Joseph, he doesn't say he was born in Nazareth, he doesn't give us any kind of earthly context, so you can't import context into it. Well, if you're going to read it, you have to read it the way Paul uses the word.
Right, he says, come to be of a woman, come to be under the law. If someone comes to be of a woman, I know you're going to probably object this is an allegory, but when we first look at that seems pretty clear first to born, as well as the Davidic idea. If someone came to be and they're of the line of David, that means that they have a blood relation.
Well,
do you have any other examples besides the legends
It's important to point out that he never says line of David. He never says descended from David.
Right. He says he came to be of the seed of David.
Yes, exactly. So, so that's the key thing. And so he uses a word that he uses for divine manufacture elsewhere. He does not use the word he uses for birth. So you can't use this as evidence for birth. I mean, it's entirely possible. Everything is logically possible that he meant birth. But you can't use this as evidence for it without importing assumptions to the text that aren't there in the text. And that's why I'm saying that this is not evidence for the historicity of Jesus. At best, it's 50-50. And I think when you look at the preponderance of evidence, it's worse than that.
But isn't that the same on your view? I mean, it's also possible it means manufacture.
50-50 means you can't use it either way, right? It's not evidence for or against. Now, I've been making a case that it actually is evidence against because it's based on the actual language use of Paul. Like, Paul only uses this word of manufacture.
But why shouldn't we think that in Galatians 4:4, come to be of a woman? It seems to me what you're saying is...
Well, he says we came to be of a woman, too. The whole argument of this is that we were born of one woman, meaning the fleshly world, and in future we will have a new mother, which will be the celestial world.
Right, in an allegory 20 verses later...
it's all one argument.
Because in verses 1 through 7, we have something that's more self-contained. There's a chiastic structure there, and verse 4
this is
brackets
all
it
one
off.
argument in Galatians 4 where he's trying to argue that you should not go back to Judaism. That's the whole point of the argument. It's like a Gettysburg Address for don't go back to Judaism. It's one coherent, complete argument. So to understand the context, that's the context. So you have to understand the entire thing. What does Paul mean by these mothers? Okay. And he goes into elaborate detail, many, many verses, explaining what he means.
He talks about Sarah and Hagar, who are historical individuals that referred to something, and he's saying that the Jews who are persecuting the Christians are like Ishmael who persecuted Isaac, and so the Jews who are holding still to the Torah, still to the temple, they're the ones who actually come from Hagar, whereas the Christians are the ones who are coming from Sarah. But the point he's making, though, but the point he's making is he's saying, well, look, this is an allegory, because the Jews are going to say, what are you, Paul? You're an idiot? We came from Sarah. No, I'm making an allegory here. How can you stretch that back to verse 4?
Because it's all one argument. The whole point is that we are originally born of this world of flesh. This is what Paul's arguing, and that we will have another mother in the future. So when he talks about Jesus being born of the world of flesh, he's using the exact same phrase he uses many verses later about how we are subject to the law, the Torah law, and how we can be unsubject to it. He's talking about us being born of a woman to be subject to it. He's not talking about a literal woman, he says explicitly. So when he starts this whole argument talking about Jesus being born of this woman, he's clearly referring to the same thing, the world of flesh, which is how being born of that world, manufactured of that world, is what actually made him come to be. Okay. Sure, we can take the neutral translation.
Okay.
Come to be of that world is what made him take on the obligations of the Torah law so that they could be killed in him.
So you're saying that someone can come to be under the Mosaic law, but not be a human being like other Jews or Israelites?
Paul is basically saying that. Well, no, what do you mean? Because it's manufactured out of Davidic flesh. He would be just like other Jews. I mean, he'd have a body just like any other actual son of David would, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, what does born of... So it seems that you're saying born of a woman means come to be under the corrupted flesh of this world and the law.
Yeah.
And born of the law means the same thing, so it seems redundant.
Well, yeah, that's often you would say born under the law, born of a woman. That's you.
Where does he use the phrase? He only uses that phrase in Galatians 4:4.
But which one?
Born of a woman, born under the law.
Well, yeah, but that's the phrase he starts his argument with, and then he goes on explaining what he means by that when he talks about why we're born under the law and what different mothers we have.
But why doesn't he say then, because it becomes confusing and you can't see where the allegory goes, saying that Jesus is born of the slave woman? But I'm saying it's still redundant.
When he became subject to the law, yeah, that's the whole point. He had to be born of the slave woman. He had to be born of this world order in order to have a body of flesh that would be corrupt and therefore be capable of dying and therefore killing sin in him. Mm-hmm. That's the whole logic of the argument.
Okay. Let's figure out time.
Yeah, where are we on time?
Where are we?
I can't see anybody's hand, so...
How many?
That's not helpful.
3 minutes?
Okay.
All right.
I don't know if that's true or if somebody just randomly picked a number. Okay.
Okay. Well... all right. Go over two other passages, because it seems to me that in order for the theory, for us to... It seems much more plausible when someone talks about the Messiah dying and being buried that it happens on earth. So we need the ascension of Isaiah to be under your interpretation. And I would encourage anyone, you can read it online and see for yourselves whether that's what the interpretation is. I have a copy here, our copy, if you want to read it.
That's not terribly useful because the online version is based on one particular manuscript tradition and not the whole analysis. So you'd actually have to look at my book when you're actually reading in order to see how the scholarship breaks down.
You don't have all of them there. You can go to
you can read it online, but you have to read it in context of the scholarship of the different manuscripts and how they don't agree with each other.
Right, and you can search, but you might need to pick up Ethiopic first. But in any case, all right. Being buried, though, I think it seems clear in the life of Adam that his, when we look at it here, even the editor here has put Adam's soul is taken up into the heavenly paradise in chapter 37. In 39 it says, now the body of Adam was lying on the ground in paradise, and Seth was mourning greatly over him, but Seth is still on the earth.
No, actually paradise, it explicitly says in there, is in the third heaven.
No, there can be two paradises, though.
But the paradise it's talking about is the one in the third heaven where Adam is buried. It actually says he's brought up to the third heaven to be buried in paradise. Paul also agreed that paradise is in the third heaven. We see that in 2 Corinthians 12.
No, but in the life of Adam and Eve, it talks about two paradises. It talks about the paradise on earth.
Yeah, but when it talks about the burial, it says the angels take him up there.
No, and it doesn't say that. The archangel Michael says, go. It says to take his soul up there. But it also says that Adam can't be buried because the earth continued to reject Abel until Adam was buried, and Abel is still on the earth.
Yeah, I'm not sure how you're reading the text on that.
No, it's right here in in chapter 40. I think this is the Greek text of it. So the archangel Michael tells the angels to go into paradise and bring 3 clothes of linen and silk, as if they're going somewhere else.
Well, you have to. Yeah, it's a third heaven. There are 7 heavens, so you'd have to go previous to that to get the whole story of what's going on.
No, it's the angels have to go somewhere else. They're with Adam.
Actually, we can make this simple. That text is online, so you can go read the whole text and then come to your own conclusion on that.
Read the life of Adam, and I think it's clear there are 2 paradises, and his body is in the earth, and I've actually cited a commentary on this that explicitly says this. They make this point, the De Jong and Trump commentary on this.
Yeah, Christian commentaries often like to say things that
it's published
the way they want to interpret the text.
Well, it's published by Sheffield, the same people that published your book.
I know. Yeah.
So
they publish Christians' writings as well as mine. So that's the way they roll.
Have we run out of?
Yeah. Okay. You may not have any questions, but you at least have a homework assignment, right?
Several.
Okay, good. All right, we're going to go to questions in the audience. Please raise your hand if you have a question. We're going to take one over here first. Go ahead.
Oh, me. Mr. Trent. Hey, to your left.
Sorry, it's coming from all directions.
Hey, first, thanks for coming out to the Lion's Den.
He has a lot of supporters here.
Yeah, no, that's true. You can clap. How do you reconcile or explain the lack of historical caretaking when it comes in a context of what a Christian would say is not only the most important man who ever walked the planet, but the only God who's ever walked the planet, especially when there are other non-gods that have had better historical records kept?
You're wondering why aren't there more Christian documents? I'm not sure. I'm not following the question.
I think I can explain.
Not only documents, but artifacts, a consistency. Like even in your own slide, I believe it indicated that the first writings of the New Testament were 45, 65, 80 years after his death.
That's not true. The first writings in the New Testament would be the letters of Paul, which would be about 20 years later.
But still, once again, we're talking, this is the first time a God, not only a God, I'm sorry, the God has ever walked the planet Earth.
Yes.
And we decided to wait to write about it? How do you reconcile or how do you explain that?
Sure. The apostles lived in a culture based on oral preaching primarily. Now, there was writing, but for example, in 2 Thessalonians 2:15, the author of Thessalonians says, to receive what we report to you either by word or by written epistle. And the majority. Sure, but most people couldn't write. Even if you could write, there weren't that many access to manuscripts. Manuscripts are written on, but I'm just have to answer your question so we can let other people go on. Okay, well the problem is when you're living in the ancient world, you have famines, you have wars, you have, people don't have the luxury they have in the modern world to hang on to knickknacks, and so sometimes things get lost over time, but other things have been preserved. But the important point is preserving the information. And the best way a lot of people preserved it was just through preaching one person to another. And we have more manuscripts related to the story of Jesus than we have for anyone else in antiquity. So I think it was well preserved. I think you get to respond and then...
Who's okay?
All right, another question over here.
Who's controlling the mic? Are we
Quick
passing
question
the mic?
for both of you guys.
Oh, wait. Should the gentleman with the mic do it, then we'll keep some order?
I can't. I don't know where they are.
All right.
Oh, okay, there he is. Okay.
Quick question for both of you guys. Is there any reliable, well, it's kind of a broad question, but is there any reliable evidence outside of the Bible, which we've been talking about a lot, for the existence of Jesus, is what my question.
My answer is no, Abedal.
Yes, I think there is good evidence. It's not the strongest, that's why I didn't include it in my case, but I think it corroborates the claims that I've made, but we're simply not going to be able to go into that here in the Q&A, but there's a lot of literature. The two I would point to, the one I'd probably point to would be two passages in the works of the historian Flavius Josephus. Richard has written on that, and others have written. There's a lot of dispute related to the passage, but I do think it corroborates what's in the Gospels. There's a lot, so just start reading online, just search Josephus on Jesus, and you'll be busy for a while. So.
Well, I would recommend chapter 8 of my book, actually, which... I mean, the main reason is that book I very carefully gather the most recent scholarship. A lot of the stuff online is based on outdated scholarship. For example, a lot of the consensus that was based on the Josephus passage about 20 years ago was based on the find of an Arabic passage, an Arabic paraphrase of Josephus, which people thought went back to one of the earlier manuscripts of Josephus, but has since been proved to actually derive from Eusebius through Syriac. So a lot of people were actually citing on one side of that based on false information that has since been debunked. So it's decisively debunked in the field. So if you want to get the most updated scholarship on that, including peer-reviewed articles and the whole deal, that's what I'd accomplish in my book.
And then I would recommend other Josephine scholars, people like Louis Feldman and others, and Alice Wheely, to compare, and you can see whose cases are stronger.
Yeah, I talk about Wheely in my book, too.
All right.
Okay, here we are. Professor Carrier, the discussion seems to be largely about the Apostle Paul, but my understanding is that he received his information from Revelation, so it's a little unfair of you to say he didn't talk directly about Jesus' preachings and his life, or he had limited evidence of that. Isn't it reasonable that if he received everything from Revelation, he should maybe not try and talk about something he didn't have direct information on?
Oh, that would have been impossible. First of all, he even talks about other apostles receiving it by revelation. He never references them receiving the information in any other way. So even when he's talking about other apostles, he says that. But more importantly, if there was a historical Jesus, and he handpicked the disciples, and they actually walked around with him and listened to him, sat at his feet, and got all his teachings in person before he died, those would be the primary things that Paul would have to talk about all the time. Because if he didn't, if he said, I don't know anything about that, they would be thrown in his face all of the time, and he would be rejected from the church. He could not claim to be an apostle on a par with the other apostles if he was completely ignorant of the teachings of Jesus. And if he was teaching something contrary to it, they would constantly be pointing out, like, no, I was there, or this guy was there, he says Jesus said this, and Paul would have to respond to that. Or Paul would have to do the opposite and say, yeah, I confirmed that this is what Jesus said because I spoke to the guy who sat at his feet. If there was a historical Jesus preaching, the epistles would look very different, because Paul would constantly have to reference the authority of those who sat at the feet of Jesus, or he would constantly have that authority thrown in his face, and he would be forced to respond to it. But we see neither of those things anywhere in the epistles. So that's actually pretty strong evidence that there was no sitting at his feet testimony, either pro or con Paul's position, because he couldn't use it, and he never had to argue against it.
And could I respond and then we can do more questions?
Cephas, James, and John, for example. He asked who were the other apostles.
Right, and I would say, though, that the distinction there is that one's authority in the church came from a commissioning by the resurrected Jesus. For example, James, the brother of the Lord, was not one of the original 12, but he still figures prominently in Galatians and the Acts of the Apostles, and Paul mentions a James apart from the apostles in 1 Corinthians 15:7. So the point was who the resurrected Jesus appeared to and commissioned, not necessarily what happened before the crucifixion.
Well, that's where the teachings of Jesus came from, before the resurrection, right?
Right, but Paul also receives teachings from the Lord.
By revelation.
Right, because I think Jesus is alive, so I mean, that can happen. To quote Peter Griffin, he's Jesus, he can do anything.
I have two quick questions. First is, how many of these debates have you had?
Me?
The two of you. Oh. And the second question is, what would either of you need to observe that would lead you to accept the other person's point of view?
That's a very thoughtful question. Well, I guess the first one's easier, just how many. I don't know, I've done probably about 3 or 4 debates. Richard has done more.
I've lost count. I'm sure it's in probably the low, maybe like a dozen.
Oh, are you talking about against each other?
Oh, no.
Oh, no, this is the first.
No, it was first in person. We did do a written debate.
We talked online.
That's like very brief, but yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, so do you want me to take the second part first? And then,
that's fine.
I mean, there's tons of things we could find. I mean, first of all, as I was doing the research for the book, I could easily have found the evidence to turn out differently than it did. And I was actually surprised to find that how poor the evidence for the historicity of Jesus was, and that how good the clues were for the contrary view. But that research could have turned out the other way. I could have found lots of really good references to Jesus if we had something like, for example, in 1 Thessalonians 2, that wasn't under the pall of suspicion of being so anti-Pauline and so contrary to Paul's teachings and not even clearly written in the time that he was alive. But if we had something much clearer, like, for example, in 1 Corinthians 2, when he says, when the rulers of this age crucified Jesus, if he'd said, when the Romans crucified Jesus, that alone would have established, or at least that would be really good evidence, and I would acknowledge that would be good evidence that a historical Jesus existed. I would expect there to be a lot more than that. Like I mentioned before, I think there should be debates over what Jesus taught to the particular disciples when they were walking around Galilee with him. That debate should be littered all over the epistles, and if we had that would be a no-brainer. I mean, if we had the epistles were actually talking about his ministry in Galilee and what he said and what people said he said, or whether they were being thrown at Paul or whether Paul was corroborating it with the ones who were there, it doesn't matter. This wouldn't even be a debate. I mean, the debate would be over. It would be very well established. We're talking about a historical person. It's the absence of all of that stuff that actually looks suspicious.
Yeah, and I would say that I need to see in Paul's letter a clear affirmation that this death and burial that Jesus is undergoing is actually taking place in the firmament or in the heavens, not just a mere, it could be, because if you read the Ascension of Isaiah a certain way, then it is like that. For me, and you know what's funny? We didn't even get to talk about Bayes' theorem in this debate, which would really go over people's heads. But I think the prior, for me, just the prior probability slants much more in favor for earthly crucifixions than heavenly ones, because lots of people get crucified on earth, and people might talk about them. We only have one disputed case with the Ascension of Isaiah, so I need a lot more something firm coming from Paul on that. Even in the letter to the Hebrews, where Jesus sacrifices in the heavenly temple, it doesn't say that he's killed in the heavens. So the lack of that makes me think Paul, the mundane references to being born and dying are mundane.
Okay, stand up so people see you. We got one here.
All right.
Hello, Mr. Carrier, I was just wondering, I feel like you didn't really address Trent's. He had these 2 main premises, and one of them was that the Gospels would have to be 100% fictitious. And to go along with that, it seems odd to me that all of the apostles except for John would eventually be killed in different ways for something that was completely fabricated and made up, to the point where today we have such a strong religion. Like it seems weird to compare it to fallen away cultish things when we have something that's lasted this long, built off fiction.
Well, we have Mormonism as a counterexample to that. Mormonism has been tremendously successful. In fact, its growth rate matches the growth rate of Christianity throughout history, and it's patently based on a fiction. Mormonism, we were really lucky because it was birthed in a country and in a historical period with documentation up the wazoo. So we have really good evidence that it's a fiction, that it was made up baloney, and yet look how fiercely effective and how fanatically people believe in it still today. So that can happen, unfortunately. But when we talk about antiquity, we have no evidence that the Gospels were written by any of the apostles. In fact, the Gospels essentially deny that they were written by anyone who was actually an eyewitness to Jesus. We don't know exactly what happened to these people. We don't know if they died, what they died for. We don't know if they died, if there was anything they could recant that would prevent them dying. We don't know any of that information, so we really can't use that information. We know lots of people who die for false beliefs. I mean, we have the whole Jim Jones community. We have the Heaven's Gate community. So throughout history, this is a thing that, so we can't really make a decision based on that. Now, when it comes to the idea that the 100% of the Gospels have to be false, that's actually not entirely accurate. I mean, that's one way to put it, but the way I put it is that what we need to look at is, can we establish any story in the Gospels that is more than 50% likely to be historical? Now, that's crucial, because you could look at a passage and say, well, it's 50-50. It could be historical, it might not be. If you're in that position, then you can't use it as evidence either for or against the historicity of Jesus. So I don't have to prove that it's false. All I have to show is that there is sufficient doubt to not know whether it's true. And I do that in chapter 10 of my book, extensively throughout all four Gospels, and show why we have strong reason to be suspicious of these as treating them like, they're certainly not eyewitness testimony, they're not recorded historical reports, they're actually literary constructs, very carefully done. And I show this not just through my own analyses, but I also cite peer-reviewed literature establishing this. As I mentioned, John Dominic Crossan has written a book on this as well. So that was all we needed, because Trent didn't bring up any specific examples of something he could prove to be historical in the Gospels, so it didn't come up in this debate. There are a lot of things that people could do to do that, and I talk about those in proving history. So if you're interested in that debate, like what kinds of passages people have tried to say are greater than 50% chance are referring to a historical event, and how I would respond to them, that's my book, Proving History, covers that part of it. So we just didn't have time to get into that today, and that's an example of what I meant, that you can't resolve this debate against the clock like we're doing here today.
Sure, and I'll respond to what Richard has said, that John Dominic Crossan does talk about parables in the Gospels. He's also adamant that Jesus existed and has argued against those who say that he does not. My other point of bringing up the example, I think, though, to show Jesus did not exist, I think you'd have to give us something where if you set the bar so high for you have to clear this hurdle in order to show that a passage is historical. I feel that my point with the Simon of Cyrene example is that the bar could be set so high, even something mundane, easy to prove, no matter what. If the bar is set incredibly high so nothing could ever be proven to be historical, then the hypothesis is unfalsifiable and it's useless. On your point about people dying for the faith, I think we do have evidence from the patristic fathers, people close to the apostles themselves did die. The letters of Clement and Polycarp talk about the deaths of Peter and Paul, and Dr. Carey is right. Lots of people die for things that are false, but it takes a rare individual to die for something that he knows is false. And I'm not sure the people at Jonestown really did that terribly willingly. But I think there's more on that could be said. But my main point is that if the bar for saying something in the Gospels is more than 50% likely to be historical is set so high when it's simple and it can be a crazy allegory about Musonius Rufus and Alexander the Great, then nothing could ever be, in theory, shown to be historical, and then Richard's theory for proving what's historical and what's not doesn't really help us.
Yeah, you can look at the book to see where I set the bar. So if you want to actually see, is it too high or not, you can make that judgment call yourself.
Okay, another question right here.
Yeah, how do you explain Luke? He was a good companion of Paul, and he totally believed that Mary gave birth to Jesus. It's in the Gospel, Luke's Gospel. How do you counter that?
I'm curious what Trent's view is on that. Do you actually think that legend is true? That Luke was a companion of Paul?
That Luke was, well, I think there's evidence for that in things like the we passages in Acts, and I think Luke has certain knowledge of Pauline activities. So yeah, I'd say so. I'd say that he at least interacted with Paul to receive information from him. I don't subscribe to your view that Acts is a Rome. I guess you say historical fiction, are you going to
Yeah.
lean with Purvo that it's a romance novel?
Yeah, Richard Purvo has written one of the leading commentaries on Acts, the Hermeneia series commentary. Also wrote a book called The Mystery of Acts, which really exposes what's going on in Acts. But I'll give you an example of why we can't trust that. The idea that Luke was a companion of Paul only appears about 100 years later. It's a later legend that someone came up with. We actually have no evidence of that. Luke, the author, never says he was a companion of Paul, never says he got his information from Paul, or anything like that. But what he does do is completely contradict the eyewitness testimony of Paul. When Luke tells the story of Paul, he says Paul started out in Jerusalem when the Christians were being persecuted right in front of other Christians, and that when he was converted, he immediately consulted with flesh and blood. He immediately consulted with Christian apostles, and then very soon went back to Jerusalem. We know that did not happen. Paul actually writes in Galatians that none of that happened, that in fact he was never in Jerusalem. In fact, none of the Christians in Judea had ever seen him before until many, many, many years after his conversion. They'd only knew him by reputation. And he says that when he converted, he immediately he did not consult with flesh and blood, he's very specific. He went away to Arabia to preach for 3 years, a whole sequence of events that's not even in Luke Acts. And then it was only about 3 years later that he went to Jerusalem to talk to the apostles. So his account of events is exactly contradicted by Luke. So even if Luke is contradicting Paul, Luke is lying about what happened. And so I don't think we can trust someone who's going to distort history that way. We can't trust that they're telling anything else true in that document.
Okay, and I think I'm going to say to that is that Luke uses a literary technique called telescoping, where at the end of the Gospel of Luke, he compresses events together. He might arrange them more in a topical order than a chronological one, and there's no reason to think he doesn't do that in the book of Acts. And I'm simply not convinced by Richard Purvo's thesis that Acts is essentially just a romance novel or an adventure story. One, because Luke doesn't even describe some more adventurous things. Paul tells himself in 2 Corinthians 11, he talks about being adrift at sea for days on end. You're right, Luke doesn't record everything, but he even leaves out some of the more adventurous things. And as for being a romance novel, there's no romance in Acts, you know? So I'll just leave that at that.
Actually, Luke does have this on the sea part because of the shipwreck is in Acts.
Right, but Paul says there's more than one shipwreck.
Well, true, yeah.
Okay, next question.
Dr. Carey, I wanted to ask about Galatians 1:19, which you've already addressed. So, in every English translation I've read, it says, I met James, the Lord's brother, which seems an odd thing to say if the Lord's brother just means a Christian, because he's already established it as a Christian by calling him an apostle.
No, actually he doesn't. This is something that's been published in the peer-reviewed literature. It's often been overlooked. But is that your question? You wanted to ask about that?
Well, I wanted to just elaborate a little bit more. He's also, at least in English also, there's a definite article. He says the Lord's brother, not a Lord's brother.
Yeah.
So it makes it sound like he's one of very few or the only one.
In Greek, that's common. So there's
that
nothing.
Is correct.
There's nothing indicative about that. But the actual grammar of that passage says he met none of the apostles, unless you count James. I mean, the grammar actually excludes that particular James from being an apostle. So essentially, he's saying that the only apostle he met was Cephas at the time, and that he also met, in addition to that, someone else who is James, and he says he has to identify that this James was a Christian because his whole argument is that he didn't meet with anybody, so he has to basically fess up to all the people he met that were Christians that could convey things to him. If you want to see that analysis and you want to look at the peer-reviewed literature on that, that is cited in my book. In my book, by the way, has a scripture index, so you can go to the back and look that passage up in Galatians and look at every page in my book where I discuss it. So you can very quickly find where I discuss that passage in the book.
Okay, and I guess my response to that is the peer-reviewed article Richard is citing is just one that was written back in the 70s. It's one, but the major translations do translate the passage. In Greek, I believe it says heteron deton apostolon uk edon. So that would be but other of the apostles, because it's in the genitive, other of. It's not a genitive of comparison, which Richard might try to argue it's other than. It's others of the apostles, ton apostolon, uk edon, I saw not, ame, except, which is an exceptionary clause, Jacobon ton adelphon tu curio, James, the brother of the Lord. And I just don't find Dr. Carrier's explanation plausible. One, you're right, in Galatians 2, Paul is saying, I didn't get the gospel from human beings, so he's going to say the people who could have given it to him, and it wouldn't be James, the random Christian, because I'm sure Paul met lots of random Christians in Jerusalem. Rather, it'd be James, one of the apostles, who's being distinguished, which would be the brother of the Lord. Interestingly enough, the terms brother of the Lord, when adelphon and curio are used in Scripture, they are only used of family members. I know Richard disputes this in 1 Corinthians 9:5.
In the Gospels, but...
I'm talking about in Paul's letters.
Well, there's only used twice, but yeah.
Right, and so that it's either all, so I can make the case it's only, that right, lots of people are called the brother, our brother, my brother. But brother of the Lord is a distinguishing title, and the title is only given to select groups, and you can read Galatians 1:19 and 1 Corinthians 9:5 for yourselves, but I think it's clear we're talking about someone who of authority, which would be James, the brother of the Lord, or relative of the Lord, who could give Paul information, not James, the random Christian.
Yeah, for my full rebuttal of that, you can look in the book. And the reason I
wish I'd written a book.
The reason I make that point is because there are a lot of issues a lot of tangents you can go on in there, and I don't want to take up all of the time on it.
What's hard is there's not a lot of great books for me to cite on the other.
Well, you might want to recommend some, like Defending the Historicity of Jesus. What would you recommend?
Okay, here's a few that I would recommend. One would be, a fun one if you like historical geekiness would be Shirley Jackson Cases. It was written 100 years ago that I think actually addresses many of the arguments even still in Dr. Carrier's book on the historicity of Jesus. But newer ones, Robert Van Voorst has a good book called Jesus Outside of the New Testament. So that would be one. Some of these arguments are covered in Paul Eddy and Greg Boyd's book, The Jesus Legend, so Eddy and Boyd. I'd probably, a good popular introduction might be Bart Ehrman's book, Did Jesus Exist? Unfortunately, it's not a scholarly treatment like Dr. Carrier's, but it's one that's there. I guess the only thing you and I are going to agree on in this debate is that there really isn't a scholarly treatment of the issue from the historical view.
Yeah, I've been trying to rattle some cages and get someone to make one. I'm kind of like fingers crossed. There's one particular notable biblical scholar who's talked about possibly writing a defense of historicity in a very scholarly way, and I really hope he does, because I want to have the ability to say, read my book, read his, come to your own judgment. I want to see that happen, so I'm really hoping someone of professorial stature or PhD stature write that book. It needs to be done.
But yeah, so I would just recommend Van Voorst, Eddy and Boyd, and then Ehrman's book is a good introduction. I don't agree with everything in it, but those are good places to start. And also online, different people have responded to things in Dr. Carrier's book, and you can look at it yourself.
Okay.
Concerning the historicity, in Eusebius, the early church historian, he says that in the early Christian churches there was a class of people who had special status. I forget what the Greek, desposini or something. They were claimed to be blood relatives of Jesus, or presumably of Mary or something, that they could trace their lineage
ancestry
back. Yes, they could trace their ancestry back, that they had the special status. So that suggests to me, if there was such a group of people, that perhaps there's an argument for historicity. But also there are some hostile accounts of Jesus from the early days, Celsus, the Roman, and also we have in the rabbinical literature we have the Toldos Jashut, which is a very hostile interpretation of Jesus' life. And he was a disrespectful boy, and he didn't respect his elders. He worked miracles, but he stole them from us. He went in the temple and he stole our magic and used that to work these miracles. So, but the thing that seems to me is if they could do something to convince people not to become Christians, to simply say he didn't exist, rather than to say he was disrespectful and he was no good, and so on. And the same thing with Celsus. It said, you fabricated your birth from a virgin, speaking of Jesus, that, and so on, and that Mary really was thrown out by her husband and wandering as like a homeless mother, and so on. But none of these people argued that he didn't exist.
Well, Celsus wouldn't know. Celsus was writing in the 160s AD, and his only sources are the Gospels. So all he's talking about is his interpretation of the Gospels. He has no access to any other data, so he wouldn't be in a position to say that Jesus didn't exist. He wouldn't know otherwise. Interesting that you bring up the Toledothi issue, which is an expansion on what's in the Talmud, because both of those documents place the execution of Jesus in 75 BC, 100 years before Pontius Pilate came into power. And in fact, when you look at the Babylonian Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, which was written in the Roman Empire, has no mentions of Jesus or Christianity, or no mentions of Jesus anyway. The Babylonian Talmud does, but they all are references to a Jesus that died in 75 and was executed by the Greek authorities, or the Greek and Jewish authorities. Actually, it was the Jewish authorities, it says. And in Joppa, not in Jerusalem, that he was stoned and then hung up, not crucified in the Roman fashion. That seems to be the only version of Christianity they're aware of. And we know from Epiphanius that there was a sect of Christians that were still Torah observant, just like the original Christians were, meaning they followed Jewish laws. And they called themselves the Nazoreans, as Acts says that the Christians originally called themselves. He says they also preached that Jesus was executed in 75-ish BC. So we know there was a Christian sect in the Middle East, possibly even east of the Roman Empire, that was teaching this, and that's the only version of Christianity the Jews in Babylon knew. It's really weird. How does this happen? How do you have a Jesus who's crucified by Pontius Pilate suddenly be transported in history 100 years earlier? I think for an actual historical Jesus, that's not likely to have happened. But if Jesus started as a celestial being, and the people inside the Roman Empire wrote an allegory, and people outside the Roman Empire wrote an allegory, later on, they would be free to place him in different historical periods. So I find this actually as evidence for the non-existence of Jesus.
And my response to that would be that the Toledoth Yeshu is a medieval legend, so it's not historically helpful. Two, people living 300 or 400 years after the fact without Google are probably going to get dates wrong. That's just the way that it is. Three, yes, the one passage in the Talmud can be interpreted to say Jesus lived during the reign of Alexander Jannaeus 80 years before he was supposed to. But Michael Cook, actually, in the Blackwell Companion to Jesus, he's a Hebrew scholar, says the Talmud places Jesus in lots of different time frames, and the rabbis are sometimes kind of fuzzy with the dates. Now, what Dr. Carey brought up about Epiphanius, which is a Christian writer, saying that there were these Nazareans who believed Jesus was executed under Alexander Jannaeus, I simply believe that that's not correct. If you read the 29th chapter of the Panarion, where Epiphanius talks about this, he introduces these Nazareans. Then he kind of acts like Grandpa Simpson, where he kind of goes on a tangent and tells a story that's not terribly relevant because he does that. And so he goes on this tangent about an argument about, is Jesus the Messiah? Why isn't he on David's throne? And he compresses the reign of Jannaeus with Pontius Pilate. But Epiphanius is clear that Jesus was born in the year 2 BC, the 42nd year of Augustus's consulship. He's not ascribing this belief to the Nazareans. He gets back to them several paragraphs later, and the only thing he says about them is that they were Torah-observant Christians. In fact, a letter from Jerome to Augustine talks about this group and says that they believe Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. And I brought the 29th section of the Panarion. You can read for yourself, for anyone here, and anyone listening, you can just, look it up online, because Google. So that's my response.
Yeah, I agree, because I disagree completely with that interpretation, but you can check for yourself.
Yeah.
Okay, here's a question.
Hello. I guess it would be for either one of you, maybe both even. But the debate's supposed to be on the historicity of Jesus. And doesn't that comprise the four Gospels? Not so much Paul, and not so much the Acts of the Apostles. It's almost half or more of the New Testament, the four Gospels. I've heard very little about it. Is it like the 800-pound gorilla in the room that no one wants to talk about? Are they so self-contradictory as to be nonsense and irrelevant, and you don't want to talk about them? Again, they are the written life of Jesus, and I haven't heard much about them.
Is the you a reference to me?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay.
It probably is, but if Dr. Carey wants a voice in too, because
I'll
again,
answer
Paul
it.
doesn't seem to be like the place to start with talking about. You start with Jesus, you talk about the birth, you go to his death.
Okay. I only had 15 minutes to present the most powerful case I could that Jesus did exist. So with history, the thing we try to do is pick our earliest sources, and we know, and one, early and reliable. So we could have a day-long debate about the nature of the Gospels, but both Dr. Carrier and I will agree that Paul existed, he wrote his letters, and they were written within 20 years, and that he had contact with the first Christians. So to figure out what they believed, that's kind of our prime place to go. And we just don't have, to talk about the reliability of the Gospels is so broad. We just don't have the space in this framework. And personally, I think, for me, even if it's 99%, and I never said that the Gospels are 100%, 100% fiction that Dr. Carey has to prove, because obviously they talk about Herod, they talk about Pilate, these people existed. It's what they say about Jesus. So for me, even if they're 99% wrong about Jesus, if they're 1% right, historicity wins. So I see the burden more here for Dr. Carey to show, well, why should we think they're 100% wrong about Jesus, and to see that historical bar. And I think with the examples, even something mundane could be spun into a possible allegory, and it's not helpful. But I picked Paul because he's the earliest. We know he wrote. We know he knew the early Christians. And he gives us a window unlike the other writers. And I think he shows Jesus existed, had relatives, and he died like any other human being.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add is to use the Gospels, you have to establish that there's at least one passage that says something about an earthly Jesus that you can establish as more likely true than not. And I have failed to find anyone who's been able to make a sound argument in that way. The closest they can get is 50-50. And that surprised me, alas.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Carrier. Just in case anyone doesn't know, do you have a book on this subject?
With a friend of mine, we were joking that in some future debate, they said they would have a drinking game in the audience every time I mentioned one of my books. And I said, don't tell me that, because then I'm going to try and fit a name of my book in every single sentence I utter, just to get the audience blasted. Yes, but of course the reason I write those books is specifically so that I don't have to ramble on for 20 hours. But
Sure. So my question, I'm very much hoping that there's a chapter in your book that addresses this. I'd just actually like you to comment on the testimony of Ignatius of Antioch. Mm-hmm. So 107 AD, so he's very early. When I read his epistles, they're very creedal. He situates Jesus historically, names his mother, who was ruling at the time.
Obsessed with doing that.
Sure. I believe a lot of scholars think that these are probably variations of baptismal creeds. So both his assertion of placing Jesus in history, and on the other side, fighting the Docetists, he also very much roots it in terms of flesh. He uses the same terms of, Jesus being of the seed of David, and speaks of his crucifixion in very real terms, and uses it as an argument for the Eucharist.
Yeah, I have a whole section on Ignatius in the book. Yes, that is true. In chapter 8, I can't remember which subchapter, but yes. I talk about this a lot. I was actually surprised to find that there's a lot of leading scholars of Ignatius don't believe that the letters are authentic. They think the letters that are, because it's complicated because there's doubly inauthentic letters. There's the short redactions and then there's the longer redactions, and everybody agrees the longer redactions are bogus. So we're really only talking about the shorter redactions, the shorter version. A lot of scholars think these were actually written in the 140s and that they weren't originally written by Ignatius and that they were backdated. Someone added that little element to it to try and make them go back further. And these are like major Ignatian scholars. So it's unfortunately it's muddled by that fact that we can't necessarily secure when he's writing. But even if he's writing in maybe roughly 110, it's hard to say exactly when. There's a lot of weirdness about the letters. For example, he says that if you interpret them the way that they're intended to be meant, which is that he was basically captured by the Romans for being a Christian, was being hauled to Rome all throughout the Roman Empire to be killed for this or to testify for this. And his jailers, his Roman guards that are taking him to Rome, take him to Christian church to Christian church to Christian church, where he's able to preach to them, congregate with them, write letters to them. and yet he's the only one they arrest, and they bring him all the way to Rome. Several scholars have pointed out that this is massively implausible as narrative, unless something else is being talked about than what was intended. And that's where some of the scholars point out, if you date the letters later, they can mean something very different. And I talk about all of that scholarship in the book. But even if you go back to 110, all he's doing is quoting some sort of divergent form of the Gospels. He doesn't indicate any awareness or any access to any other information other than the Gospels for his information. So he would be representative of one of these Christian sects who believes that the Gospels are historical truth. But there's no indication that he believes that on any other information other than the fact that the Gospels were presented to him. He doesn't reference eyewitnesses. He doesn't reference any fact-checking of these things. And it's also weirdly suspicious that he's so hyper-obsessed with historical details in the creed, which is weird. So why is it creedally necessary that Pontius Pilate, of all people, crucified Jesus? Why is it creedally necessary that his mother be named Mary? He's very obsessed with insisting that people include these in the creedal statements. Why would that be? So there's a lot of suspicious details about it, but if you want to see the full analysis of that and the scholarship cited, it's in the book. Yeah.
And I guess my response to that would be that even if some of the biographical details get muddy, the fact is the letters of Ignatius do report a firm historical view of Jesus, and Ignatius in his letters is fighting a very particular heresy called the Docetists. It comes from the Greek word dokain, which means to appear. So this heresy was that Jesus came to earth, but he only appeared to be human. So he's still God, but he's got this human costume on, like it's Halloween. And so he's still God, but he didn't really become human because gods don't do that. So Ignatius is clear, no, he was truly of flesh, truly born of Mary, truly suffered. And that is something, and what's interesting, he doesn't argue against people who say there was no Jesus, and I brought up earlier, these people went MIA, and they were the descendants of Cephas and James, and I'm wondering what happened to these people. I think Ignatius should know about them to argue, because if the Docetists really rankle Ignatius's chains, the Mythicists would make his head explode, because they say there's just no Jesus at all, but he's not aware of them in any form. But I think if you read his letters, there's a firm Christian belief Jesus was an historical individual. And also, though, the letters of Aristides, who is a philosopher, wrote about 15 years later. He mentions Jesus' earthly details, but he sometimes leaves names out. He says, born of a Hebrew virgin instead of Mary. So we see this historical core going back. The mythicists are not there.
That's all 2nd century stuff. Those were 100 years, basically, after Christianity.
Yeah, so it's not the strongest, why I didn't include it, but it's interesting to comment on.
Thank you. And the last question, just for Mr. Horn, thank you both very much. This all seems extremely detailed, and we all need to study, first off, obviously, by reading Dr. Carrier's book. But my curiosity is it's very interesting and confusing to figure out if such a person actually existed that these stories are based off of. My curiosity is what everyone actually believes of and what most people know of in regards to Jesus and his life seems to be completely off the table as far as how historically accurate that could be taken and believed.
I'm not sure I followed your question. The idea is that I didn't address the things.
No, nothing you didn't address. This was on the historicity of Jesus. This is a separate question.
Yes.
What most people believe of Jesus, all the miraculous claims, the divinity, the virgin birth, and resurrection. Obviously, that doesn't seem to be something that can be scholarly taken seriously.
Well, I think it depends on your worldview. I mean, if you believe that miracles are impossible, or that miracles don't happen, or if you believe that historians cannot scientifically discover miracles even if they occur, then yeah, that will cover your scholarship. But the question you've asked betrays larger philosophical questions that we can't possibly get into right here. But I think they're certainly on the table. I think that even many secular scholars will say that some of the firm historical facts about Jesus, if you don't set the bar impossibly high for what's historical, that we can know that Jesus was at the very least a faith healer, for example. Healings and exorcisms were important to his ministry. And there is a huge gamut of what's called historical Jesus scholarship. So I guess what I want you all to take away is that there's not just there are the atheists who say there was no Jesus or we can't know anything, and the fundamentalists who say that God basically just kind of auto-controlled Paul and Mark and Matthew and wrote everything. There's a wide range of scholarship, of scholars who can affirm different historical aspects of the Gospels, maybe not others, but apply the tool of history. And I can think of a few that you could look into on the more and closer to Richard, but nowhere near there. It might be like Father Raymond Brown, for example. I don't agree with all of his. For example, he denies the virgin birth, but says the resurrection is historical. Or you could even read the work of Pope Benedict XVI. His volumes on Jesus of Nazareth talk about applying the historical critical method. So I think we can use principles of history to at least historically corroborate some gospel details, even the miraculous. But it's a whole different ballpark, and we'll have to come back to another debate for that one, I guess.
Yeah, but to tie it all together, since we're concluding with this, it's notable I mentioned that Paul never references Jesus ever being a miracle worker or a healer or an exorcist. That doesn't seem to be a part of the gospel at all. It doesn't seem to be anything that anybody talked about in Paul's churches or to Paul or from Paul. Paul never talks about that at all. And yet in Philippians 2, he says, the creed there says that Jesus divested himself of all divine powers, gave up everything and became a slave, which allegorically must mean a slave to the world. This actually seems to deny that he would have had any miraculous capabilities or like the ability to heal or exercise and so on. So when we get the Gospels and suddenly he's this world famous or regionally famous healer and exorcist, when this was nowhere present in Paul and even almost outright denied by Paul, this is evidence of fictionalization, right? What we're seeing, of course, what Paul does reference in the epistles were the miracles of his own congregations. The apostles could work their magic through works of power. He explicitly refers to healings. There's things he says that suggest that we're also talking about exorcisms as well as Christian acts. And so the Gospels appear to be basically taking what Christians were doing in their churches and basically projecting them onto Jesus as a model for what was going on in the Christian churches. Or so is my theory. Trent would probably disagree with a lot of that. But that at least brings us back to what the debate here is about that particular aspect of it.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for sticking it out. I know we went a little over time. Oh, please give a very large round of applause for Mr. Trent Horn of Catholic Answers. Very large round of applause for Dr. Carrier. Both of these gentlemen have tables out here. They will be available for you to purchase their books, for you to sign, to have them sign their books, to say hello, to say thank you. Please do so. We could use some help if anyone has some strong arms to clean this up. Immediately following here, purchasing books and saying thank you, we are all going to be heading just 2 or 3 blocks down the road here to Studio Diner. They have food available for us. They've got the back patio blocked off for all of us. And we're going to head over there to have some dinner, have some drinks. There's beer and wine, have some discussion. The reservation is under Jesus Debate. Easy to remember. Thank you all so much, and God bless, or whatever.
Or whatever.